Welcome to the video, Training Activities on the Path to Competence. We can use the path to competence as we design, as we facilitate workshops. We can use it to diagnose where we think participants are on the path. Then we can choose learning methods, learning topics that meet them where they are and support, nudge them to move along their own learning journey. So during your needs assessment, you'll ask questions about the current level of knowledge, the current level of skill, about whatever topic you're designing. Ask questions about the ability of the participants to implement their knowledge and tools and skills, their degree and consistency of their demonstrated capacity. Again, it's no longer enough to know these, have terms, concept knowledge, their capacity to infuse into everything they do. What's their current level? And what's the degree of resistance to the equity, inclusion, diversity efforts, EDI efforts? So Doctors Jack Gant and Delight Frost adapted the unconscious conscious learning model that they attribute to Abraham Maslow. And then they overlaid DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and created the path to competence. So for me, it's an incredible roadmap as I design and facilitate. It helps me identify again where people are, where the organization wants them to move towards. You can actually use the model to get your client, whoever's hiring you, whoever's asked you to do the workshop, the leaders of the organization, to identify not only where people are, but where they want them to go. And then help them think about what training will help them progress along their path. So denial, I find that the workshops that I'm asked to do in different organizations, many, if not most people are in denial, but they would deny that they're there. Most have not had much training. They remember maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, but it's not an integrated part of all types of trainings, professional development, coaching in the organization. And so they are in denial. Now, I also find a lot of folks might be in judgment, and they may know that from their marginalized identities, they may be in cumulative impact, experiencing generational trauma. Again, all this can be unconscious. The current national context is enough to have people in their marginalized identities move into judgment if they're not there already. The organizational climate and the low capacity leaders, supervisor, colleagues may have people just at a deep emotional level towards others, towards themselves. Now, people in privileged identities, less often in judgment because you have to have a pretty good awareness, and most people in their privileged identities are still in denial, in my opinion. But if they've had some training, some development, reading, maybe friends, maybe family members, then they might be in denial. Have moved out of denial, be into guilt, shame about themselves. Why didn't I learn more, do more? Anger, blame towards others, the systems, other marginalized folks, other privileged folks. And they may be judging your capacity to train and facilitate. Now, if an organization's been doing some work for a while, and people have really been showing up, then you may find a lot of folks are in fear. They know more, they're more aware, but they're really aware how ineffective they are. And in a good foundational 8-hour training, many people can move into the box of fear. It still might be early fear, but they can move out of judgment, out of denial, into early fear. And many folks in my workshops might be stuck in denial and move really close to the line to fear. They might be into fear, but if not, they're really much more aware of dynamics. They're still very ineffective, but they're like, I am really much more aware. Not how much we need to be, but they're on the journey. Now, occasionally, if I'm working in an organization where they have internal change agents already, people whose main job is to create equity inclusion in departments, divisions, then you will find possibly some folks in engagement. But they've had to have lots of in-depth training, practice development, and there have to be ongoing structures for learning and support to have people be and stay in engagement. And in my experience, I rarely find people in the box of competence where they're just naturally effective. They might have moments, but to find people that are there much of the time, it's not my experience. And so what are the training activities that can meet learners where they are and support their movement along the path to competence? What I intend to do in this video is to share my best thinking on top of the author's work. What are the types of activities that facilitate movement in each of these 5 elements? And as you get the competence, how do you keep deepening your competence and stay on the path? So denial. Again, unaware, ineffective. We don't know what we don't know. Now, we think we know all we need to know or all we want to know, and so people might be intentionally staying in denial. But we're stuck at the individual level of denial, and I believe there are a couple versions, and maybe even more. There's passive denial, where you're unaware, you just haven't learned yet, you're in blissful ignorance, and there's been no motivation from you or others, the organization, to have you move out of denial. And then there's active denial. That's where you believe the biases, you're actively working to resist, maybe undermine the EI efforts. You're sharing biased thoughts with no concern, and you're just showing up and doing it. Active denial. Some of the key pieces here: denial, you have to recognize and own your group memberships and own that group identities exist. The group level is real. So you have to acknowledge the breadth of group memberships, where you are in each of those groups. So you have to own then your memberships, as well as when you're in privileged and marginalized groups. To acknowledge the existence of bias and prejudice, how these fuel microaggressions, and understand really common privileged marginalized dynamics at the interpersonal level. Those are the microaggressions at the systems level, policies and practices. Privileged folks create barriers for folks in marginalized identities. So when you're designing, or you're in the moment and you're redesigning and you're facilitating, the intent of the learning activities you choose for people in denial is really to increase their awareness of the dynamic difference, so they don't argue, oh, this is just an exception, this is a one-off, this is an individual incident. They're not using all those traps and potholes. That person's so sensitive, they're oversensitive, they're militant, they don't have a sense of humor, if they only were more competent, if they just stopped making everything about race. So when you hear those kind of comments, it's a quick clue people are stuck in denial, unaware of group level dynamics and oppression, and they're incredibly ineffective. And so the key in our designs and facilitation: increase awareness of how much they don't know. Help them recognize how they've been sheltered and then chose not to find out more. And then increase their willingness to learn, to keep learning or growing, to stay open to new ideas, actively expand their knowledge and awareness, possibly some tools. But again, in denial, we can move them into fear where they're aware, but they're still ineffective. And so here's some possible learning activities, and I have several slides because there are so many strategies that people in denial can benefit from and need to. And even if folks move quickly into fear, all of these same learning activities would be one I would recommend if you're coming in and people say folks are aware and effective. I would still do these because folks are all over the box of fear, possibly early, middle, late, and these are just good competencies to have. So as you're designing workshop, you may want to consider coaching the leader in how they do framing. Having somebody own that this is their workshop, this initiative, and why it's important to have equity inclusion as one of our key strategic goals, and why now in the life of the organization, in the national, local context. They have to be able to speak about how EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, is tied to the organization's mission, your vision, your values, your customers, current, and the ones you want to attract and retain. They have to talk about the business case, so not only about customers, but about the impact of EDI work on the bottom line, our revenue streams, on recruiting top brilliant talent who are not only talented and sharp in their content of what we hire them to do, and cultural competence, so they're able to build inclusive teams, inclusive organizations, serving increasingly diverse clients we are attracting and want to retain. So really focusing on customer service and how to stay competitive. And they have to talk about how this training that these folks in denial are going through is so related to their current job and how the organization will be requiring, expecting, holding people accountable for infusing these skills into everything they do. So the leader has to own it and use their positional power to underscore these expectations of participation and learning, skill development, how it's not just a nice thing to do, but this is a job requirement now and increasingly in the future. These kind of expectations and clear accountability structures may help some people in denial who may still be resistant, but go, if I want this job and stay here, then these may be the sorts of things that I need to do. I don't care how people move forward. If it's out of fear they may lose their job, if that's their current motivation, I know in these workshops, they'll get other motivations as they open their heart and really understand the dynamics of difference and privilege marginalization. But the clarity of accountability and expectations may help some pay more attention and get off their phones and not be doodling as much. And then you'll follow with your opening, which again, I could get people up and moving if the leader, I like them to do 5-ish, maybe 7 minutes, but if the group is stuck, I might get them up and moving. Or I may often will have them get to know me. And so it's about building relationships with participants. And that's partly sharing your passion, why you are committed to supporting the organizational mission, values, vision, strategic plan of this organization. And make sure you do your homework so you demonstrate and show respect for the work that they do. And everything you talk about, tie it into their work. Folks in denial don't see a reason to do this. It's not part of their job. So the more you can tell stories that you're hypothetically coming up with, or you hear stories from your needs assessment of how this work has been incredibly important in the work that they do, but mostly showing respect for what they do in the world. I think it's important to share a little bit about your learning journey, some missteps or two out of your privileged identities, how you're still learning and how you're here to learn with them and support them to develop the competencies that the organization is expecting them to have and demonstrate competently. Now, to do that, there's all kinds of ways I get people moving. If you've seen any of my workshops or listened to any of my other videos, then you know I like people getting up and moving or moving in their chair to meet people, greet people, 2 or 3 minutes just to say hello to 5 or 7 people, and then in no particular order, a number of different things to create the container. And remember, there are 3 acts to any workshop. The opening act, which is creating the container, kind of like a play. The body of the workshop, where you'll do lots of the intentional knowledge building, skill practice, and then action planning, where they think about how to transfer these into their daily experiences. So you're truly trying to build the container for authentic engagement with self and others when you're working with people in denial. Probably anytime, but in denial, it may take quite a while, 2-3 hours to get people loosened up and moving, if that. And so I always mix people up. I think it increases their connections, builds relationships with people they may not naturally have, and so they may get different stories, different input. People in denial often hang out with the same people in my experience, and so breaking that up, generally, gently is how I do it. I'll name why I'm doing what I'm doing. But if I see the same table is sitting together for everything, I'll come over and not physically touch them, but just to come over and say, so here's what I'd like you to do. Count off in 7, and then this table over here, count off in 7, and then go find your partner. And so I will come in and do it myself if they're not willing. So we're building the container for authentic dialogue with self as well, because this might be the first time, again, being compassionate, that some folks have in a workshop intentionally had to think about some of the topics and concepts you're offering, much less increase their self-awareness. Their hearts may not be used to the level of microaggressions they're going to hear, and maybe increase their awareness about their own experience of being treated less than. And so without shame, blame, staying out of the box of judgment, that's the intention as you're getting people moved into either pairs where they find different people each time, concentric circle, where there's a circle inside a circle of people in pairs, and you move them, invite them to move. And that way, if they're really deep in denial, I like concentric circles because that forces people to have to talk to somebody new. And it might be somebody they work with that reinforces the status quo, but more likely with the roll of the dice, they're with different people than they usually work with. And then finally, bingo, the activity where you can put 3-4 of these questions into a bingo worksheet, and they move around, and then they have to talk to 4 different people in order to get the bingo, and have a prize. For people in denial, have prizes. I like to have buttons that have some social justice message on them, and I might bring some that are not as controversial, and I might throw a few in because I let people come up and pick the one they want. You can also have granola bars, those sorts of things, but add the competitive nature, I think, with people in denial. That might help them do it. And then, of course, yell bingo when you have it, and that might get more people doing it, and then send the winners to go back and help people win. So some of the conversations I like people to have, what is the source of your passion? That word might be too strong in denial. So it might be, why is the organization committed, and why are you also committed or passionate about creating greater equity inclusion? And the language you use, you may want to even shift that language because people may not even know what you mean by those terms. So people in denial, I'll do, why is it important to you? Notice I use the word important because that word may resonate as opposed to passion. Why is it important to you to help create a workplace where people feel respected and valued, where they feel they belong and they can be productive? So that language is all about inclusion in my mind. And yet people in denial may push back if you say equitable inclusive, much less socially just, racially just. Another way to phrase it, I do two parts. Develop and provide products, services that really meet the needs of our current customers and help recruit and retain future ones. So that language, I think, is generic enough that most folks can buy into it. You can have people talk in pairs and hear 4, 5, 6 out. Make sure you're using microphones so you help people hear for different reasons. Ask who relates as you move around and find people to share. Another one that I like to do is, how is what you do related to what the senior leader talked about, related to our efforts to create more inclusive work environments, to expand our customer base. So how is what you do either serving our increasingly diverse customer base? How is it about creating an inclusive work environment for the people on your team? How is what you do working with people in other units respectfully across all differences so they better serve customers? How is what you do related to creating policies and practices that create inclusion? So now I'm adding the words equity inclusion. I'm also kind of describing it a bit more. But I find when I work with folks in denial, again, this isn't a judgment. It's that they haven't had the training before or they haven't sought it out. And so to realize what I do in accounting helps people have a paycheck, which helps them be motivated to come in and serve customers. So they see how they're in the line. And it may be, I serve these people who serve these people who serve these staff, and they work with customers. But to start to have them think, what do I do in my day-to-day life, how I treat people, but also the work that I do, how does that support people who actually do the work of equity inclusion with our customers or design policies? Have people share some of those out, 4, 5, or 6, again, who relates, and then it might just get people thinking. Sometimes I'll do that in groups of 4, and I'll say, if someone doesn't know, then just ask them some questions, or say, here's what I know you do, people in your job do that helps, so coach each other. I might start actually with the next one, 10 things in common and differences, and that could be in concentric circle. Again, if the people are feeling really stuck in denial, I might even do this before passion. And I have them first with one person, what are 10 things you have in common? And give them a minute and a half and to count. And by the way, people in denial having, I believe, a time frame that's a little faster may help them do it a little faster. And then 10 ways you're different from each other. And after each one, you're asking, what was that like? And was it easy, hard? And again, you're just warming people up to have the conversation about differences or getting some breadth of differences. It doesn't have to be social identity groups. It could be, I like lasagna and I am allergic to fish. I don't care what it is. They're talking differences and they're just moving slowly into the capacity to be where you need them to be effective change agents. But it's going to take a while. A very common one early on, 35 years ago, someone did, and I've used ever since, is a time you mattered. When do you remember any organization, any group, could be family, neighborhood, when you knew you were valued, respected, you felt you mattered? Let them talk about that in a minute and a half each. Hear some of those out. And then the question, what was the impact on you? And if people feel matter in the organization, what's the impact? And you're getting the business case. They're just getting it in their bodies. Impact on productivity, teamwork, working relationships, customer service. And then I like to move people, but you can keep them with a high five buddy. Now, what's any time in your life when you felt you were treated less than, whatever the group identity. Now, notice I'm gently saying it has to be a group identity. A group you're a member of or someone thought you were. Maybe they thought you were growing up or maybe they thought you were gay, maybe they thought you had a disability. You didn't, but you're like, wow, this is how folks in those groups get treated. So anytime you were treated less than, how were you treated? What were your feelings? What did you do? And again, for both of these, and well as anything, you want to share from your own experience and maybe a step or two lower, deeper in vulnerability than you think the group might go. And some may go there. They don't have to, but if they see you do it, they might be willing. And then really here, I would say 6+ here. And just get people to tell stories and say you can nudge your partner. And then who relates or who's seen the same dynamic. So you're building people's courage, having people amplify their voice a bit, having people realize it may be a brave space where we can talk. And they're sharing stories. It increases the peer influence. When they're hearing a story from a peer, they might be willing to listen more than if you bring in a video or if you tell your own story. Once they bond with you, they'll be much more open to your stories, but this is still the first hour. And so they might not, they may think you're trying to manipulate them. But when peers tell them a story, and then you amplify the peers' voices by inviting people to share in the large group, can really begin to unfree some of the denial and some of the resistance in folks. And similarly, what's the impact on our colleagues? What's the impact on customers if we as employees feel we are marginalized every day or several times a week in this organization, or we feel marginalized in society and those emotions are in us as we come in? It's building peer-to-peer dialogue, and it's creating that +1 dissonance. People cannot, if you're trying to teach algebra and they don't know basic math, it's going to be hard for them to learn algebra. And so if they can be talking to people that are kind of where they are and maybe one step ahead of them, they might be able to get some of the learning through their peers as opposed to learning it from you or the lessons that you brought in, which may be way too advanced. Another one I like to do, either again on a bingo or consent circles, is what do all people deserve and no one deserves? You can also get these pairs to just marginalize to get with another pair and just brainstorm in their small group, at least 10, what no one deserves and what everyone deserves to experience in this organization, so we can have a high-performing, inclusive organization. You can brainstorm at large group as well and who relates in. Again, we're amplifying the expectations of what type of work environment people want and what type of work environment helps us be our best selves as we're serving others. Some point in Act 1, you're creating the container for learning. You're going to have to create community guidelines for people in denial. This really helps them claim what they need to learn. And you may do a scale 0 to 10. How willing, ready are you to be brave and authentic? And I don't make people move. If they're in engagement for sure, even if they're in fear, I might literally have a continuum where people claim the space and then be able to turn and talk to someone about why they chose that number. 0, not at all. 10, completely ready to engage, be authentic, vulnerable. And then ask, so what do you need to maybe move one more number so you're willing to move a bit? So that can be really powerful. And further, denial, I'm assuming they're at 0, 1, 2, and 3. So I'll just ask them to think about a number. Maybe if the things are loosening up, I invite them to share it at their table. Or I say, think about your number and now look at this list of possible working agreements, engagement agreements, and which ones of these and what other ones would you like us to negotiate as a team here in this workshop, so that you might be able to move a half step or a full step closer to willing to get a little more honest, even if it's with one other person or yourself. So you may have your own list. I have, I think, 14 that I often use that you'll see in the materials. Now, in denial, you might want to anticipate some that'll come up, like we need to be kind and polite. And stay out of the box of judgment when you hear this. That's what I'm telling you, so anticipate it. And then just ask a question, well, tell me more about that, and what's your concern, and what would kind and polite look like? To be honest, you really have to be in the box of engagement to do training with people in denial. And I'm not saying early engagement. I mean advanced engagement when you're often in competence. Again, that doesn't mean a lot of the time, but you slide into competence unknowingly. If you're still in the box of fear of judgment, I really ask you, don't be training people in denial, because you'll feel triggered, you'll push back in unproductive ways, they'll just get stucker, and then they won't ever come to any of these workshops for a long time. Even if they're required to, they'll find ways to not. Anticipate other add-ons in community guidelines work. People shouldn't take things personally. Again, so tell me what that means, and when have you taken something personally? People need to trust our intent. People are a lot of different places. We need to have a lot of grace. No attacking, no retaliation. So anticipate those, and actually you may make yourself a note of what others will come up and how you might engage folks. And just be ready to explore and discuss and ask, so what would you need? What would be the behaviors that will help you learn? And have people identify those, and then ask people, what do y'all think about these? And it's a co-created, because again, you have folks in very deep denial, potentially early fear, and you may have a few folks in engagement or judgment, and judgment folks are going to want to judge folks, to ask for us to be polite and trust our good intent. Well, if you dig underneath it and you find what are the behaviors that will help you learn, you might be able to get to some of the negotiated ones that I have on my list, like name if you feel triggered, trust that we're going to learn together, lean into discomfort, take a risk, listen hard if you disagree, ask questions, those sorts of things, which I think create a learning environment for anybody, but particularly folks in denial. It's okay not to know, and lean into learning more. That's not in mine, but that one might be a good one. Now, folks in denial often will ask, well, what do I say? How do I not get in trouble? So instead of resisting that, I think sharing some terms, some useful language, answering their questions could be useful. And so if you've ever experienced a safe zone training around lesbian, gay, bisexual, and some organizations add transgender, it might have a whole safe zone training just around gender identity and transgender dynamics. They focus, I don't do these, that's what I'm saying, they focus a good bit on current terms, what not to say, what's problematic behavior, how to be an ally. And that's a key learning area for folks in denial. I say they, when I've been in denial and when I'm there again, I'm like, okay, what do I say so I don't get in trouble, how not to be called racist or transphobic or sexist or xenophobic, against immigrants or whatever. So you want to know language, and again, the potholes. I think it's useful. Now, I don't spend a lot of time here because I think you can get stuck swirling there and bogged down, but maybe I should spend more if I really know folks are in denial. And so you could have 3 out of 5 cards on their tables, on their chairs, and you can say and you're welcome. If you have any questions about anything, particularly language and terms, go ahead and ask a question and just fold it up. And as I come around, if I see stuff on the ground, if you want to put them in the back or up here on my supplies table, or you can hand them to me as I walk by. And then at different times, I'll look through them and maybe answer some of these. Or you could have a whole section just on Q&A. So have everybody write something, fold it up, give it to you, or trade them. And then people open them up and you just have a Q&A. I mean, some of them are blank because nobody has questions, and then some of the questions about terms and language. If people have written, what would you do if this happened, and your supervisor does that, you say, well, let's hold that for later because we're just on terms and language. Because if people have a chance to write questions, they may expand the boundary you're trying to hold with this. And avoid getting what I judge as bogged down, because I think it's easier to stay in, how do you say what's right? Can I say girl? There are women I work with that say girl all the time, so how comes a man I can't say girl? Or what do those black people want? Again, those black people would be a clue. People are in denial, maybe active denial. What do black people want to be called? I mean, I called someone black and they were offended. They said they want to be called African American. So again, I might in that moment say, well, tell me more about what they actually said. Well, they said they don't use the term black, they use African American. I said, and that was about their tone? Well, yeah. Your tone sounds like you're being descriptive and just sharing information without much, passion or much positive energy. They're just saying, I actually want to be called black, or I want to be called African American. So how come you heard that as an attack? Now, that's a much more advanced facilitation tool. So I might instead do a relate in and a share. And I say, sometimes when folks of color have been just clear and direct, I hear that as an attack because I didn't realize how I want them to take care of me or be smiling or to really give me feedback in ways that are really gentle. Um, that's a great intervention for someone in the box of fear and in engagement and denial. It might be too much, and sometimes I can't resist. I just can't let something like that hang in the room. So it's easier to get swirling in terms than to do the personal work. So listen to your gut. How much is enough? And say, if you have more, maybe we'll do some, maybe at lunch, have a table if people just want to come over and talk terms and language. Again, it's a little less time for you to have a break, but it gets you some time to keep moving. Now, let me be clear. I don't do all these things in a one-day workshop. But if people are in denial, these might be ways to think about what they need and do them in a series of 3.5 days or something like that might be useful. Now, relevant statistics can be very powerful. I remember working, it was with the LCI Cross Associates group, and I was co-leading, working with a financial institution, a small bank, a series of banks. And we gathered data about what are the current demographics in their current workforce and locally, because they really pulled locally from the state or one or two metro areas. And so what are the dynamics, what are the demographics current and projected for the next 5-10 years? And so I turned it into a quiz. Some were yes, no, some were multiple choice. And it was really powerful. Really helped them think about the current climate, because we had some questions about, from a current survey, some of the themes, organizational climate, again, disaggregated by group identity, but really some data that could help them think about current retention, current recruitment. And I would always have you have race as one of the data points you share, as well as several others. Sex assigned at birth would be the most common. If you could do hierarchical level, that would get people talking about the class dynamic, so that would be great. Sexuality. If you have others, if you have some focus group data, folks around people who are parenting or who are pregnant, often there is some great data around that. National stats from surveys to help people see the biases that are there, the experience of people with disabilities, again, numbers, as well as the bias in hiring that exists. Folks that married, single. So you notice I'm picking some that aren't usually necessarily the first ones people seem to talk about, and people in denial. So we need to help them find their place in marginalized identities. And so using statistics can help them find their place. So in addition to the changing demographics, or to really help people get the business case, the leadership case, there are some data on recent microaggressions, hate crimes, again, statistics, how many. That was probably 15 years ago. I did that quiz, but there was some current data about how many people that are LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, reporting hate crimes. If you were doing it today, the increase in anti-Semitism, the increase in anti-Muslim that have been recorded, the increase of racist incidents that are being reported, and hate crimes that are happening nationally. And if you can get local stats, it would be great. The increase of sexual assaults that are being reported, sexual harassment. So those kind of data in this current frame that we're in could just, again, it's passive learning. People are looking at the quiz. I read every other one. This side read the evens, this side read the odds. Which one stood out to you that might be particularly important to talk about today or in the organization? And go find somebody that read the other page and then talk and then hear that out. And so, again, repetition is incredibly important. The leadership case was talked about by the leader. You might have reinforced it. In some of the conversations about martyring got reinforced, marginalization and mattering. And then in statistics can be very helpful. People learn through stories, people learn through stats, different times, different ways. So it could be a thing you can get your HR organization, your inclusion practitioners, your facilitators. You have affinity spaces. They might Some of those folks might be willing to do some research. They may be having access to resources you don't know about, or you can ask them opinions about where you should do the research. So make it a change process that gets a lot of folks involved to collect up these statistics. At this point, many people are ready for a different kind of learning environment. And so the who are you from sustained dialogue, the individual group organization, can be a great activity. Again, a new partner, levels of change. So who are you as an individual? Who are you to group identities, and use those group identity cards. So again, they're getting reinforced breadth of differences. At this point, often I'll do socialization, but you also may want to do the organizational level before you move to socialization. What's a policy or practice that didn't meet your needs any time in your life, or you realized the policy, practice, or service didn't meet the needs of people you cared about, family member or friend. Now, again, you have to give several examples because people are in denial, and so they may not think this way yet systemically. And you can have them share out. You usually have 4 or 5 share out. So all this first act, we've kind of moved, actually, we're slowly moving into act 2, the body of the workshop, is getting them connected, introducing the concepts in a low risk, low resistant environment. There's still going to be pushbacks and yeah buts, but you're gently moving people out of denial, or at least closer to the line, and hopefully not into judgment, but into the box of fear. Now, the cycle of socialization can be a very powerful way. Dr. Bobby Harrow, Bobbi Harro, her work at University of Massachusetts Amherst and her doctoral work and expanding it since then really gives a framework for conversations about socialization. And or you can also come up with a bunch of questions. I know in my materials I have a whole bunch of reflection questions. But to deeply dive into their own socialization. Now, denial, you may want to dive, if I use a swimming pool analogy, they're in the really shallow end and you have them walk a little deeper so the water gets up to their waist. You can do socialization in the box of fear. I'd have them get up to their chest. So let them go however far they'll go. You can do it through drawing, notes, reflections, then sharing. But it's to get much more aware and honest about the impact of learning experiences, early those experiences. So they get, and you repeat what Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington writes about. It's not our fault, but we have to accept responsibility for what we learned and shift. But more, it's just getting them to hear other people's stories. Ideally, 10 minutes to reflect, and then an hour in groups of 6 to share and relate in. That's what we do at the Social Justice Training Institute. And that's just focused on issues of race. And so as you're doing this, I would always have race as one of the categories they reflect on, and then 3, 4, or 5 more. Which of these identities, what do you remember in your interactions? What do you remember who were the leaders? What do you remember what was said around you? What did you learn in school? Who did you hang out as friends? What kind of activities did you do? All kinds of ways you can prompt. If you wanted to up the ante a bit, it could be, when do you remember people were treated differently based on this group identity? So again, they've chosen 4 or 5, and they can then tell stories. If they chose disability, I remember my younger sibling was treated differently, had a learning disability. Or I remember my uncle had cerebral palsy, and I remember how he was treated. So they could tell stories of when they remember people were treated differently. They're not saying there's prejudice and bias yet, but they're telling stories, and they're realizing, ooh, there was, I just don't see it today. If people are still resisting group membership, you could ask them to remember when in high school, when in junior high, what were some of the cliques? What were some of the groups that got treated as cool, were valued? And what were some of the less cool, less valued groups? And they don't have to say which groups they were in, but they can talk about what were those groups, that's group membership, and then how were those groups treated? And then what were some of the assumptions that were made about the people? It's often, the people on the football team, the cheerleaders were the cool, and the folks that were doing Dungeons and Dragons, I might be dating myself, never played it, but folks that are really into computer games might be the current variation of that. Folks that were academically focused, maybe not as cool. So some organizations, some high schools, that might be cool, but usually, my experience, not. If that still's not getting it, you can also say, so talk about what are your kids, how are they getting treated at schools? What's happening in schools? Who gets treated well? Anybody getting bullied? And then they'll tell you. Kids who may not have the social skills, the social capacities to engage, the ones that are overweight, the ones that, quote, aren't pretty, aren't handsome, aren't very athletic. I'm in my early 60s, and the same dynamics I hear as I talk to teachers. So what's happening to nephews, nieces, friends, family members? And you may want to, especially if you're in an area and you're doing training in a specific location, you may want to be talking to local schools, or local different religious, spiritual organizations, some community organizations. So you're getting some of that data if people don't give it to you. But the reason I offer that is there still might be people that say, we're all individuals, we just work hard, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, that's all you have to do. Put your head down, do your job, and just don't take this so personally. Well, high school, I don't know about y'all, I still carry some pain around high school, junior high, and young people in their lives. People may go, oh. So those are things to have in your back pocket. So as you're doing socialization, usually there's good storytelling. What's the impact of that? They're getting breadth of differences. The common ground activity, some people have called them step-ins, that has some ableist language there. There are many variations. I haven't done these in a while because there's so much else I want to get to. And yet, if a group is really in denial, it can be very powerful. If I'm doing team building with an intact group in denial, and some folks are particularly marginalized identities are saying there's microaggressions and most people don't see them, then I would do common ground. And the intent is to invite people to really notice how many differences there are among the people in the workshop and or the team as people publicly claim the different group memberships they're in. And so how it works is everybody's in a circle. You can be, it works if people are able to stand, and if some want to use the chair they use all the time, or be in a seated chair, they can raise their hand to acknowledge, yep, I'm in that group. You can do it either a couple ways. You can have a list already where you might start out with wherever you told you were born, what parts of the world, what's your family structure, and then move into others that may or may not be societally as hot button, but doing all the different group identities that might be in the group identity cards. I've done that and asked people to move in. And so on race, I might have 7 or 8 different variations I'll have people move in on. You can find those, Google them, probably email me, and I can probably find one from 10 years ago that I used. And you can also, what I often do is have people name for themselves, because again, they're in denial. So I don't want people to feel like force them to out themselves, engage their resistance proactively. And so I'll have a list of all the categories of difference on a screen, and I'll say, so just keep glancing up at this list. By the time we're done, I'd like something from every category difference claimed. You might be in the privileged group, the marginalized group. You may or may not want to use that language so early at this point, but just find a way to get that in the room. And so this is a common enough activity that people may have done in community groups, retreats. They may have done in high school, college, if that's their experience educationally. So you have people move in. And I'd always, give the examples of the rules and the framework, and then you model a few just to warm people up. But usually folks will claim their own identities, and if it's not working, you can also just say, and you can think about close family, friends, children, young people in your life. Again, no names, but someone may move in and say, I work with several people who have children with disabilities, and I realize I don't know enough, right? So they can just move in. You move in, you move out, you're paying your notice. Most people just do this as demographics, and that can be enough. And if you want to up the ante, you can do a part 2. I give them a chance to debrief seated and then say, let's do a part 2. And it's you're going to share the dynamics that you've experienced or observed. So a time, family, close friend, you experience being treated differently based on X and kind of what happened. I've experienced this. So I've experienced, as a lesbian, I've experienced someone in a pickup truck driving by and screaming F you at me at night while I was on the street. I felt scared, right? And then do a couple out of your privileged identities as well. As a white person, I have heard and seen whites tell racist jokes, and I didn't interrupt and nobody else interrupted, right? So share a few different ways to do it. People in my family have experienced, so show them how to do it so they don't have to name it. Again, they move in to take a move in, a step in, claim it. Other people that relate move in, you notice, you pan, you move back out. You just keep doing it. So all of these, whether you just do the demographics or if you add the part two experiences, it can quickly move people that are still holding on to the individual level to go, oh, there's group level dynamics, demographics, as well as experiences all around me. And so it's just a wonderful, emotionally connecting activity, if well debriefed, can help people really move. So some other denial learning activities are recognizing bias activities. And you can do this in a number of ways. You can have people with case studies, scenarios, reflect what's a possible bias fueling this. You can also have people do an activity. I don't know where it came from. I first saw it with the National Multicultural Institute when I was doing some facilitation with them. They had an activity, which I think was someone made, and they just got rights to use it, where I think they showed 6 different partial pictures of an individual, just kind of like in a circle, and just enough. You got skin color, some appearance, maybe some age you could infer, maybe sex assigned at birth you could infer, but probably not. And just people quickly write down what's first impression somebody might have. And you can up the ante by saying, what's your first impression if they're willing to get honest? And then ask, do you think we would hire this person here? Why or why not? Have people share that, small groups, large group. And then you pull out to the full picture, which gives you much more data. And then there's some short bio information. By that time, it's debunked the assumptions, the stereotypes, and people like, oh, it's really getting how we quickly, first impressions, limited information, based on stereotypes we learn in socialization, make biases. So those are a couple different activities that can help people recognize biases. You can also take the times they were marginalized, because that's personal, and in small groups, groups of 3, remind people the story and then have them brainstorm what were the probable conscious or unconscious biases that might have fueled that behavior. I've never done this, but I thought, what would it be interesting, people in denial, if they read some memoirs of people, not only marginalized groups, but maybe privileged groups that are a little farther ahead, that are change agents. They could do that pre and post. It doesn't have to be a whole book. It could be a couple chapters, get more awareness, information, and also share current daily dynamics, the impact of generational trauma, but also healing and how do you show up and be a time change agent. When I've done work with whites around racism, actually mixed groups as well, I love doing a racial timeline, a history timeline. And it would probably be in a 16-hour workshop. So whether it's a weekend retreat or 2 days, you can prepare one that's related to your industry, your field, and the location where you are. So if you're in Iowa, Iowa history. If you're in Texas, if you're in New York. So come already prepared, and you can put them on 8.5 by 11, 2 or 3 on each page, and just by century, as well as you get in the 1900s. I might do it by decade, might be too small a list. Maybe by 1900, 1950, 1951 to 2000. Well, probably by 1960, I would do it by every decade and then just keep going. And so everything, like if I was doing financial services, banks, I'd have things about redlining, mortgages, the 2009 recession that was caused by very racist, classist, greedy, capitalistic policies. And then hiring, the GI Bill, which gave my father access to graduate school as well as money to down payment or get a very expensive mortgage. So we were able to bump up our class access very quickly with that GI Bill. So you have some already, and then in the room, have people go around and add some to that. You have 5, 8, 3 by 5 cards, Post-its where people write what they know and then go post it up. You can also have quick videos about history, but there's so much missing information, propaganda, myths that have been taught and they're still being taught, that to get more history in the room can help people fill in the blanks and realize, we didn't get here today, that there's long systemic manifestations of oppression. And you can do that through history. And you can also do it, I learned this at University of Massachusetts Amherst when I was in the social justice education doctorate there. One of the ways that we were taught, let's say we're doing a workshop on heterosexism, they had found and researched housing, education, legal systems, marriage, policing, employment, healthcare, just major institutions. And then what are some dynamics of historical but also very current manifestations of oppression, policies, laws, practices that have a negative impact. And they did the same around race and racism, sexism, gender identity, classism, religious oppression, increasingly so. By the way, you can Google the authors Maurianne Adams, Lee Bell, Pat Griffin, and get the original book, Teaching About Diversity. That's not quite the full title. Then you'll see subsequent versions. There's, I think, at least 3 or 4 versions now of readings, as well as lots of conceptual understanding about how to teach, train, and then documents that are 16-hour workshops that we were trained how to do and then taught when we were working there as graduate students. So just tons of more information to how to facilitate as well as design around individual identities as well as some intersectionality identity. So people in denial, another activity, very powerful. I learned this with the Elsie Cross Associates. Had us bring in magazines. We invited every participant to bring in magazines, newspapers, and had them in small groups scan and pan the media. And so just flip through magazines, and with, at that point we were doing race, gender, sexual orientation 20 years ago. And so had them just use those lenses, or you could have just one group do race, one group do sex assigned at birth, one do sexuality, one do gender identity. One could do class, one could do disability, or you could have them have the group identity cards and choose 4 or 5 and be looking for that many. And just look through, how are people depicted? Who's there, who's not there? Would they see themselves in this? Looking through current magazines, newspapers, websites you could have up. You could have stations, one with magazines, with newspapers, one with websites, where people just move around. They spend 10, 15 minutes at each one, and just what do you notice by group membership? Then I'd have a station of your organizational materials. Again, your website, brochures, anything that you publish, including policies, practices, you could have it all there. Another activity we also did was have people wander around in the building. There was often training either in a hotel or in a building that was part of the organization. And so have them go out in 2s or 3s. It works as a break. So you have 20 minutes to wander around, also take a break, and come back and notice what's on the walls. Have them take the group identity cards, what's in posters. Just notice the people you'll see around you, who's talking to who's sitting with who, and just see who's represented, who's not. And also be tracking accessibility, not only of language, accessibility of information, as well as accessibility physically and emotionally. So this is a great hands-on experience if folks are at the individual level to start to go, oh wait, in magazines, all the people positioned as leaders. Wait, in our website, all the pictures are mostly of white people. Men are mostly positioned as leaders. And then give people homework. Pan everything. Pay attention now with a group lens. TV, soccer practice, commercials, the papers they're reading or writing, Facebook, whatever they're doing, pan it with an inclusion lens. And so really getting media and environments hands-on and then come back in and share. I also like people at this point, if you're doing a series, to pan interactions. Coach, what'd you notice interaction on TV? So it's not just demographics, you're asking to look at dynamics. This prepares people to begin to look at privilege and marginalization. And so the playing card activity, which I learned at Simmons College back in 2007, and I've used it ever since. any kind of simulation that's really engaging quickly. It's a privileged, marginalized dynamics. Again, there's many different ones you can find in books on the internet. And then you debrief it using group identity cards. So they're having to give examples of who gets treated as high card, i.e. privilege, who gets treated as low cards, marginalized identities, and are there some identities like hierarchy where there's a middle on the continuum, skin color possibly middle on the continuum. And you debrief it. How's it like society? How's it like our organization? And you're getting people to tell stories of when they've seen it, when they've experienced it. And that gets, again, that peer training. More likely to believe from peers, more likely to share a story in small groups as opposed to a large group. And they're more likely to ask each other questions to get curious and say more. And they're more likely to say, yeah, but. And then folks may say, actually, it happens a lot. And they might hear it from each other. So this is a way to introduce the types of microaggressions and impact at the group level. And then I really take my time in denial to have people explore microaggressions using at least 3, if not 4 activities. And again, all these activities are great if people in fear, because they have to realize what they still don't know and then be willing to speak up. In denial, I'll keep going until folks say things like, I had no idea, this is horrific, people should not experience this, and you can just feel the room has shifted. So if it goes faster than doing all these activities, but I still think it's useful to do them. And so my handout on unproductive meeting behaviors, make your own. I think I have 38 very common dynamics. I have people reflect on that. Just in general, what's the impact? How often do these happen? And folks usually like, these happen every day, all the time. I become immune to them. I do them. It's just business as usual. So then what's the impact in general? Undermines everything we're trying to do. And have you ever done them? Yeah. Did you mean to do it? Well, no, I was just overexcited or I was stressed out. So you don't have to have conscious intent to negatively impact others, and still it can be a negative impact. So you're getting in intent and impact before you bring in group membership directly. And then I say, so any of these behaviors, white person to white person, man to man, 62-year-old white lesbian to another one, right? Have a negative impact. But if somebody, senior authority, position of power, does it to somebody that's new and low level in the organization, what's the impact? If that person is white and the person who's coming in and entry level is a person of color, what's the additional impact? If someone who does not have a disability interrupts talks, we're the only person with a disability in the room, what's the impact? If they also are a single parent. So I just kind of rhetorically ask that and people go, oh yeah, there's much more. And I just gently add. And notice I did have race. I always center race. And then I add other identities that often aren't named. And I think more people, more whites have more experience with people with disabilities than they do people of color in intimate relationships, friendships. People have much more experience around class, probably cross-class than they might in cross-race. I could be wrong about that. And so bringing in other identities, again, single parent, so that people see themselves in these dynamics and microaggressions. I want them working privilege. People in denial are not going to be willing to work privilege until they get heard their marginalized identities. You can more directly talk about intent and impact. Again, we may not have intentional conscious bias and still have a negative impact. There's a huge need, I think, for people in denial, actually all the time maybe, but especially in denial, to not be seen as or called ist, classist, racist, homophobic. And so if you can give an example about how you personally had no idea that you would had this impact. You were just moving too fast or you just didn't realize. And so the one I think can be useful because it's a models classism in organizations, hierarchy, is I'll say if I'm trying to buy something and the person who's on the phone with me, I'm not getting what I want, or I'm calling back because I got the wrong thing and they're not moving very quickly to make amends, then I'm embarrassed to say, but I have raised my voice, I've gotten indignant, and I've said, I want to speak to your manager. And so I wasn't intentionally being classist or intentionally disrespectful. I just wanted what I wanted when I wanted it. and the impact. How many of y'all have been impacted that way? How many of y'all have done this? Again, I wasn't thinking, I wasn't paying attention to my impact. I wasn't thinking about my intent of how I would treat others. I was only on the intent of, I want what I want now, faster. And if you do other workshops with me or other coursework, there's many other ways to teach intent and impact. I think it's critical in denial to help them separate that there are two different things. Clearly, the second thing around microaggressions is a list of common microaggressions, because folks in denial don't see it. Now, they've been hearing stories, but they're literally, I think I have 84 now or 90, a list that you might only read a page or two, but then in small groups, share which ones feel familiar, stand out. I like to overwhelm people in denial. I mean, not like overwhelm, but just saturate. That's a better term. And so get a list of just generic ones that happen, have at least 10 to 15 different group identities in there, alternate them on pages. So if you're only having people read a page, they at least get 8 or 10 different differences on that page. And it's just slowly you're wearing down the denial, the unawareness, because they can't argue. They'll still try to argue, but they're like, they'll pick the one or two they think they can argue, but the others emotionally they're sitting with. So the one they say, yeah, but this has nothing to do with race. Well, let's talk about it. And then talk about it. Or that happens to me too. And I'm white. Well, let's talk about that. You might also want to use video clips of microaggressions to bring in other voices, so you're not depending upon the folks in marginalized entities to share, and that's why things are written down as well as videos. The John Quinones, What Would You Do, are some great ones. The Dr. Joy DeGruy, Go in the Grocery Store, but there are so many out there, and you can just pull them off of TV, YouTube, check with your organization to make sure you can use things that you just kind of pull off of media. And if not, you can figure out legally how you can use them. Or you can have people make them. Have some of your folks further into box of fear and engagement and competence be willing to take some of these microaggressions and act them out to the point of conflict and not resolution at this point. So we're just saturating a powerful activity which will get the last remnants of denial generally. Now, folks may backlash, go back like a rubber band, but if you pull it too tight or too fast. But often when I do the gallery activity, real examples from your organization that are generic up, anonymous, so patterns, common dynamics, not one or two things that people would know who it is, but just the common dynamics. Collect them from the organization in focus groups from the survey data. And again, let people know you're going to use them in training. You can collect them in trainings like this. Again, let them know you're going to use them. And then go through and edit them and then share them with a couple people. So people are like, yep, nope, these are generic enough. So half 50, 60, I like to put them on 8.5 by 11 again, 24 font maybe, 32 font, so that people can read them if they're visually, quote, blind. I meant to say legally blind. And move people into small groups, have them read them. What I'd like to do before that is actually have people write one. Again, if they're in way early denial, you may or may not want to, but by now, if you've done much of what I'm suggesting, they are full of some stories maybe. So say if you can't think of something, look back at that microaggression list and see which one happened here, and just write it down and add maybe the nuances of how it happens here. No names, no department, no indicators besides the group memberships that are important to the scenario. What happened? How did people feel? What was the impact? Or just what happened? Let people 5 minutes or so to write, fold them up, trade those 5 times, have them get in groups of 8 to 10. At the table already have or hand out some of the ones that you've gotten from the organization so that each table reads the 8 to 16, because I like people to write 2. One where no one spoke up and one where someone tried to intervene. You might only get 1 from some. So they'll have, 8 to 15 plus another 15 or 20 from the organization maybe. And then show them how they're going to trade either within 3 tables or just keep trading around 10, 12, 15 minutes of reading. No interruption. You just keep reading. and then keep training to get more. They are so saturated now, debriefing around feelings and what are you noticing and impact. And by now, folks are usually pretty ready to leap into the box of fear. They're like, what do you do? This should never happen. Impact of reading these. People will still be in shock. I can't believe it. But listen till folks say, if they say, I don't believe this happens, say, well, what do you other think? And then people will say, oh, it happens. But if no one says it happens, say, well, what if it did? You just had 20 people in the room write some. Now, you may not trust that I got these from this organization, but I did. But what if all that you just read are just the tip of the iceberg of what's happening in this organization? What if? So that might help the last few folks be willing to move into some skill building. I also just had this idea. It might be interesting to have a panel. Now, you could have people who, small group facilitators, there the whole time, that are kind of very advanced, box of fear, even early engagement for sure, and or bring them in as a panel to, at the end, say, here's what I was like. Here's how I kept learning and growing. It was not always easy. And here's what I try to do now. And maybe tell a story of how they spoke up and intervened pretty effectively. It could be really powerful for folks as they're moving into the box of fear to realize there's hope. Now, again, all these activities are useful in the box of fear and judgment generally. And there's some specific ones for each of these elements that I just want to highlight as we keep going. So again, the box of judgment, we are just unaware that we're ineffective, or we're aware we're ineffective, or we think we're effective in all of our blame and judgment. We think it's useful to be just swirling in this, but we're really ineffective. Unproductive thoughts, feelings, and actions, we're swirling in blame, shame, judgment, anger, guilt. We're usually blaming and judging others, and blaming and judging and shaming ourselves with guilt. We also may have lots of unproductive anger. Now, let me be clear. I think anger can be incredibly useful and passion. But I have swirled in unproductive anger and judgment and blame and shame of society and others or my own group, and I haven't taken any effective action. I have reacted out of that deep rage, anger in ways that actually people backed off, shut down, got more stuck in denial or resistance. So I think there are effective ways to use and be in anger. And when I'm in the judgment box, I'm usually very ineffective. So the intent as you're designing activities for folks in judgment, acknowledge, feel, and express their emotions in productive ways and confidential spaces to know they're not alone. And so it really is a lot of self-work. It's probably going to be a lot of navigating their own difficult situations, intrapersonal roots that fuel their reactions. Because we often judge others who remind us of ourselves. They might be undeveloped, unhealed parts of ourselves we're projecting on others. And we may not remember what we were like. So lots of remembering when you were, when you did, so that you have more empathy and compassion when you meet folks who are not as far along as you and you're judging them. Now, you may not relate to the person in front of you when you're all in judgment, right? But you might have a different category difference. Oh, so I might be in judgment to people who are U.S. born and so anti-immigrant, and I'm just in rage and judgment that what the policies are making. But if I go, oh, wait, as a white person, I know that level of ignorance, not knowing, and blatant racism. Okay, I know that part of me where I have those racist attitudes that I still trip over. It's a bridge. So the skills you want to have them learn, not only sharing all the emotions so they don't hold on to them, hear themselves, hear other people relate in, but then shift the thoughts to continually identify the unproductive thoughts and shift them over and over and practice new ways of rethinking your intentions. So in my navigating triggers work, it would be shifting the story you make up about people at step 3, exploring step 2, intrapersonal roots that have you fueling that story. And then at step 5, what are your intentions as you're moving in judgment, anger, shame, guilt towards others, towards yourself. And then redirect all that energy and passion to deepen your own learning, your own skill development. So you stop spinning and swirling in those emotions, but you use that energy and passion, keep learning and growing, and identify what you need to do and what you need to stop doing. Do more of, do less of, keep doing. Lots of healing work. Folks in our marginalized identities, it's a lot of healing internalized oppression, which may just mean recognizing all the societal messages, all the dominant culture we absorbed. There's going to, in my experience, a lot of pain, anger, shame, guilt. As we've colluded with that, and there's going to be cumulative impact of the microaggression, systemic oppression, the generational trauma. So lots of work in affinity spaces can be helpful. And then our privileged identity, affinity spaces, equally helpful. Our work is to look at our internalized dominance, the oppressive attitudes, behaviors we absorbed, accepted as normal, and work to unheal that. The more as whites we get to talk about our racist attitudes, behaviors, how we still have them, the more I see whites show up effective engaging other whites, not in the box of judgment, but more into the box of engagement. I'm just like you. I've done it. Here's what I just did last week. That's the goal out of our privileged identities in my experience. So some possible activities. Have people really identify and explore the full breadth of their membership in all multiple privileged identities. And again, using the group identity cards, lots of storytelling, recognizing when they're in privilege, marginalized as well as maybe on a continuum. So group identity cards, I have people literally make 3 lines of cards. Some people end up making 4 and 5 because there are just so many nuances with the intersections. I don't care. But they're getting that in some identities, they've got privileged identities, some marginalized, because many people in judgment are even judged in a single issue focus or a small cluster of identities. And so to really help them work their life experiences, their level of competence in the full breadth of group categories of difference and in their own life experience can be very shifting, and especially in their privileged identities. Really do that work to loosen up their judgment. Socialization can be a powerful way to do that. What were the biases growing up? And folks are aware-ish of oppression. They may not be aware of their incompetence, but they're aware of the dynamics of oppression. So they're able to go deeper into that cycle of socialization. What were the biases, examples of prejudice, microaggressions around you, and way full breadth of differences here. And what were some of the bias and prejudice you acted on or you just believed were true? And then what helped you shift? And so I often will have people, even in denial. I have had groups, I may not have done it in the morning, but by the afternoon, think about a time you used to have some bias and prejudice and what helped you shift. And the emphasis is on what helped you shift. And so as people in denial are recognizing there's bias, that's kind of they're moving into fear or judgment. But this question can help people really, and it's usually they're in a privileged identity, but not always. I believed what they told me, and this is what helped me shift. And then really focus on, as you debrief it, it was personal experiences. I had a friend who I became a member of that group. I was in a course where people taught, and I really did some reading. I watched a movie, and a friend of mine really confronted me, and I cared about my relationship with them. And so getting what helped you shift, and then think about in the action planning, Act 3, what can you do to bring more of that into your life? Again, the point here is to get how you've participated in upholding dominant systems, or maybe how you resisted from the beginning, but to get them to really find times they did collude, they did go along, and what helped them shift. It's that Reverend Dr. James Washington, it's not our faults, but we must accept responsibility to move forward. Part of that is time they believed and acted on these dominant narratives, the biases from their privileged group and also from their marginalized. Now, it may have been out of survival and trying to just get food on the table, especially in our marginalized identities, but have them really tell stories, relate in, I'm not alone, and that's why this work in affinity spaces can be great. And it also can be great in cross-group identity if people are willing and able to own privilege and marginalized identities. And then, have you been just like the people you judged? So that's, after I told a lot of stories, you can tell some stories about, as I was working race and starting to work whiteness and resistance, I realized, I sound like heterosexuals. And as a lesbian, I spent years in the judgment being so angry at heterosexuals and heterosexism. And then I'm like, oh, I'm just like heterosexuals. It gave me a lot more patience and compassion to not only engage heterosexuals and help them move, but also as I worked with people who are white to go, oh, I get what denial and judgment look like. Not useful, ineffective. So affinity space is to really share your emotions, talk about the imposter syndrome, collusion, really share and learn. And again, you might use readings. What's the emotional toll, all the emotional labor, all the tax that is put on marginalized group members in organizations and society? And whether you're in the privileged or marginalized group, to really get that concept when you're in judgment. And you may want to have folks who are farther along to come in as panels, as guests, to be a part of, small facilitators, again, using videos, readings, books, to just bring in more information about how folks moved out of judgment and moved into using that energy to develop capacity to then speak up and interrupt, and why. You can't jump over the judgment box if you're there. There's a depth of healing work that has to happen. When people are ready to do some skill development, it can be useful to talk about times they've reacted less effectively out of their biases, privileged, the common biases, the attitudes, the common behaviors we have, what's the impact, and what did we get out of doing it? So what, I know it's a strange question, but what were the quote benefits? When I thought racist beliefs, when I thought people of color were not as smart, I got a hit of I'm better than, I'm a hit, I'm superior. And that balanced out all the imposter syndrome, maybe not all, but a lot of it. And so if people can see the really yucky ways that we used internalized dominance, oppressive behaviors, biases, attitudes, that'll help want to then heal that. Times people have colluded, either in your privilege or your marginalized identity. Now, I don't have folks in marginalized identity share times they colluded in front of privileged folk. Generally, when you're in judgment, as you get into engagement, for sure, we need to be doing it cross identity, privileged, marginalized. That capacity to fluidly move back and forth is what we need to develop. But here I might have them in affinity spaces. They can choose a marginal identity they want to talk about, and within that brave, safe space to share. Folks that have a lot of privileged identities could, if they can't think of any, it could be when you were younger. Everybody was younger, or a time you were new to the organization. So they're reflecting on how they stayed silent and colluded, and then a lot of relating in has to happen to judgment. And then what were the biases fueling your unproductive comments and behaviors, privileged and marginalized identities? And then how have you effectively shifted your biased thoughts, your stereotypes in the moment before you reacted? This is, you can start to hear the bridges to the box of fear, trying to get them out of judgment, realizing how incompetent they still are when they're just swirling in judgment, and reminding them you have shifted your negative thoughts, your judgments. You have reacted more effectively sometimes out of different intention, and I'm going to put you in your place, or you're bad and I'm right. To do the healing work, I think folks in judgment deserve the work around navigating difficult situations. There's many sources of that. My book, Turn the Tide, is available. Have people really identify their common triggers, their hot buttons, the intrapersonal roots, the reason that what fuels the biases, the cumulative impact, the beliefs, our fears, our expectations, our judgments that fuel our unproductive behaviors, and lots of healing work that can happen in affinity spaces that are well facilitated, and can happen in community groups that are facilitated, that are set up also for this kind of healing work, and can happen one-on-one if you can find folks who are able to do this work with you. Folks need to be able to identify their unproductive reactions, the 4 F's when you're in judgment: fight, flight, freeze, flounder. I think most people in judgment might be in fight if they're going judging others, blaming them. If you're judging yourself, you're probably floundering, freezing, not knowing what to do. So this again is a bridge to the box of fear, but can be very powerful people in judgment. Navigating themselves when they have triggering moments so they can be more clear and respond effectively. I would do navigating triggers At a minimum, judgment, fear, engagement, competence, because each time as you move along path, you'll get more, you'll be willing to go deeper, and especially healing those intrapersonal roots. And I've been studying that work, I have to count, at least 25 years now, if not more, including writing a book about it. And I still am learning so many complexities and nuances. And so repetition is needed, especially around navigating triggers. So again, all these activities in judgment as well as denial are useful in fear. And then here are some things about fear. Again, when you're in the box of fear, you are aware how ineffective you are. Again, increasing awareness about the dynamics of oppression, differences, privilege, marginalization, but you're increasingly aware that you do not know what to do. You're aware of how unskilled you are. Now, if you're in early fear, you kind of have probably this general fog of, I don't know what to do. But you may not know exactly how unskilled you are because you don't know what skills look like, what effective looks like. So that's part of what's happening here. You're stuck walking on eggshells, don't know what to say, don't know how to be effective. And if and when you do speak up, you're almost always ineffective. You may have a glimpse of, well, wow, that wasn't bad. But generally, in early awareness, always ineffective. As you move further into the box of fear, you might get increasingly, somewhat, maybe occasionally effective, but you're just not there yet. So the intent when you're designing activities for box of fear, increasing awareness of what they don't know. That's why continuing to do microaggressions work is important. Socialization work important. Even skill development, but how ineffective they are, they need to know. Now you need to do it in ways that they don't run back into the box of judgment or back into denial and they're like, I'm shutting down, I'm not doing it. And so it's still scaffolded in gradations, but you're getting them to own and talk about their fears and emotions so they realize they're not alone in their incompetence, and really identify what they need to learn, whether that's in worksheets, I have several of those, and or they're just throughout trainings, they just see people do things more effectively, and so you help them identify what were the skills, and then let's practice those. Have to keep learning, expanding the toolkit, and practice, practice, practice. If I think about learning to play the clarinet, I was in the box of fear. First I was in denial, then in judgment. And then when I got a little better, I was still ineffective. I was in junior high, high school. I probably never practiced enough to be good. I never got to competence. I always had to use music, sheet music. But there were moments that I was pretty good when I was in high school. I think a year in college I played. But most of the time playing the clarinet, I was in the box of fear. It took lots and lots of practice, and I still wasn't very good. You had to keep expanding how I played so then I could maybe be in a jazz band or something. So possible learning activities when you have people in the box of fear. Now you might be thinking, I have people all over the place, but that's why you find out generally, and then when you're in the moment, you have a lot of different activities in your back pocket. I've been in one of my live workshops, I have lots of handouts. And that's because I never know what I need to do. I have a plan, but I won't know till I get there. And I might use a handout differently. If I get there and folks are really pretty advanced fear, close to engagement, then I'm like, ooh, I'm going to do microaggressions differently. But if they're mostly in denial, then I'll do it as I've already described. So here are the activities. Clearly, creating team guidelines will be important, but also making sure you have the lens of they're going to be afraid of making mistakes. So you might add some. So what if people say or do something here that's a misstep? How do we want to engage each other? So anticipate what the ones around fear might be. Taking a risk, leaning in, be brave. What kind of environment help you be brave? So focus in on the ones that might be more fear related. Another one, again, microaggressions, but again, you can do it a little more advanced. I would still do unproductive behaviors, my list, gallery activity, but then I'd really have them in small groups telling stories. Which ones of these feel familiar to you personally? And you could do that at any point, if not all three. But authentic dialogue across differences where they're really sharing examples, and you might have to give them a structure and maybe have a small group facilitator. Just listen intently and talk about the impact of hearing the stories. Relating in, just give them those two skills to practice. This will get them to a deeper emotional level, and they'll also be learning and also of examples of microaggressions, but they'll also be really building relationships with each other and their capacity to have authentic conversation. That's the skill building we're doing, authentic dialogue. And then you want to talk about whether you're telling the story in that moment or after they've told some stories. So what's the negative impact? What's the cumulative impact, emotional tax and labor? What are the privileges or the behaviors of privileged groups? And have people have the space to express their emotions as they're getting these kind of concepts. If you're kind of scanning and panning from denial to judgment to fear, you're seeing similar material, just done differently, deeper, and a lot more emotional, full body. Intent and impact, if you haven't taught that recently, then teach the concept. You may want to have them really be looking at scenarios and the personal examples maybe they just told. What was the impact? And did anybody ask you the impact? In that moment it happened, did anyone say, I apologize? What was the impact of my behavior? So again, you're modeling a skill that they could start practicing in fear. Most people say no. And so what was the impact of nobody doing that? What was the impact when people went right to intent? Yeah, but I didn't mean it, or I'm a good person, or I have a friend who. What was the impact when folks rush to intent and don't listen to the impact? And so talk about that and then practice or show a couple videos of what's it like. Maybe you demonstrate from the front of the room. If you did a misstep, hypothetically, here's how I might show up, and see if someone's willing to, give you some feedback in a role play, and then you demonstrate how you could engage them. There'll be somebody in the room that might be willing to do that. And then emphasize whenever our behavior, because in fear, we're ineffective. So when our behavior has a negative impact, go into these 3 steps. I apologize for the impact on my behavior. If you're open to it, I'd like to hear more about the impact I've had, and I commit to changing. Just give them 3 quick steps. Now, some folks, if they're in judgment, might be pissed off that you're having to tell people how to do it. But when you're learning to, play a trumpet, you just learn 1 or 2 notes at a time, and then you learn a third, and then you learn. You gotta scaffold this. People in fear, I think they've really got to understand the 4 F's. I have a worksheet you can make your own of what are the common behaviors. So I have people identify what are yours and what's the impact when you show up in fight, flight, freeze, or flounder. Let them talk about that. And then what are your thoughts when you're in flight? What are your thoughts in freeze, in flounder, and fight? And then how do you shift those thoughts to be effective? What are your unproductive intentions? I have a whole list of productive and unproductive intentions. You've probably seen it in the Navigating Difficult Situations work, so I'll pull that out again. So what are these unproductive intentions you've ever had when you've been in the 4 F's? And then practice shifting those. What could you say to yourself instead? What story did you make up? What story could you shift so that you're not in so much fear? You're not wanting to fight so much. Whatever it is, practicing. Now, they're not going to be perfect, but let them practice it. Write it out. Share in small group. Use a large group to adjust, nudge a bit. Wander around, so if people are really stuck, you're able to coach them in the moment. And then they're needing alternative ways to engage out of these new thoughts, these new intentions. What would you want to try to do? They might be able to say, well, I'd want to do this. That's the first step. Imagine what else is possible. The skills to do it, the courage to do it, that keeps coming. But in fear, to imagine what could be possible. And then you want to talk about costs and benefits of speaking up. So if we first, actually you may want to do that staying silent. What are the costs if you stay silent and you're colluding? We're perpetuating the dynamics in the work environment. People are being hurt, feeling marginalized. But what are the benefits if we stay silent? I get to keep the privilege. I got a little access here. I get to hold on the belief I'm okay. I won't get negative feedback if I don't do it well. So let them talk about that. You may want to create a list of the costs and benefits that they can work off of. Sometimes with people in early fear, they may not have answers to these questions. So if you know my work, I have lots of worksheets. And then once people see it, they're like, oh yeah, I relate. We're still working on the costs of collusion or why we don't speak up. And so having some clips of people colluding, and or begin to show clips of, so you can show a video to a microaggression and stop it and say, why might you not speak up? And that's kind of colluding, being silent. And then what are costs if you do, but what are benefits if you do? So it's another way to get cost benefits that might be a little more media focused. And then you can also show clips of engaging effectively. And that, again, you can have people make them for the organization and show it. Make sure people know these are not real situations, but these are ones we've heard about, and these are actors that are just showing us some pretty good ways. You can also look at folks that are on YouTube like Jay Smooth, Francesca Ramsey. I think I mentioned John Jonas already. Dr. Joy DeGruy, the Go in the Grocery Store one, has her sister-in-law, Kathleen, intervening with the clerk at the grocery store effective ways. So showing effective ways that people speak up. You can have people then talk about the costs and benefits of speaking up. I think it's fair to, you have to talk about this. People are in the box of fear, and so that's what they're choosing to hold on to really tightly. I could lose my job, I'll lose access, people are mad at me, I'll hurt the relationship. So again, you may want to have a worksheet. What are all the fears you've ever had that you chose to stay then silent because you're afraid of something could happen? Let them get honest and talk about it. If they can't talk about it, they're going to be stuck in it. You need to loosen up, help them unfreeze holding on to that fear. And then what are the benefits if we do? And I don't mean you get promoted. I mean, what's the impact on you, on others? I get to live in integrity. We serve customers better. I interrupt a microaggression. My friend doesn't have to experience the pain. So let them talk about that, because what we want to do in fear is get people really more motivated, because they have to have more willingness to try new things than the fear they're holding. You have to shift that balance. And they may not be able to do that work as clearly. And so you may want to be looking at worksheets on more productive reactions, more ways to engage, and some case studies. What could you do? What could you do? People in fear also have to be navigating difficult situations. And so you really want to be similar, as I spoke before, but I've already shared a good bit about that, doing similar work around that, shifting the unproductive thoughts, the unproductive intentions, and then how do you recover if you misstep? That's a really important one to do. You want to make sure that they see some demonstrations of how to do it, you model it, they get to maybe talk about what they might do, have the steps written down, and then role play and practice. Watch some of their peers doing it in a fishbowl, and then they have to learn by doing. You just can't conceptually know how to do it. They have to practice how to do it. A few more things in fear. While they're not ready to do it, maybe they can be in a room where somebody with more experience and skill leads analyzing policies, programs, services, practices with an inclusion lens. And so in the box of fear, they might be able to be helpful or at least not be resistant. And so have them practice doing that to see what else is possible, what more they could be learning. Again, we're helping them see what they don't know, and this is at the systems level. Box of fear caucuses affinity space, critical to be able to have that authentic sharing about feelings, to mess up, to ask for skill building, to practice. Again, trust that somebody in that group of 6 or 8 is going to be +1 and can help somebody learn and grow. But to do it within similar affinity spaces, privileged and marginalized, is critical. And healing spaces, facilitated healing spaces, caucuses, as well as other supportive environments, is critical to heal the internal dominance and the internalized oppression. And the cycle of liberation. Bobby Hara also has that, and you can find it, I'm sure, online. But to show that there are ways out, and here are the steps. Now, they're doing some in these workshops, but to give them a vision of what is possible. And always in the box of fear, reading groups, clubs, video clubs of what's possible, deepen learning. There's just so much more to learn. Even as I'm in engagement or early competence on some issues, I'm still learning the nuances, so on and on and on. Now, engagement, again, all these other activities may be useful, but if you have a whole bunch of people in engagement, there's some other things you could be doing. Engagement is where you're increasingly aware of the dynamics and you're pretty effective most of the time. But you have to concentrate and focus. I have to think about where my fingers go. I'm playing this really difficult piece on clarinet, and I have to think about it and have sheet music. So I have to think through what I want to do. I have to think through what we're going to plan to do, have an agenda, have a design, and I'm consciously thinking about it as I'm doing it. That's the box of engagement. So the intent, if you have a lot of people in engagement and you're designing for them, either a workshop or a learning plan, lots and lots of practice until it becomes a habit. You may reminder tools, kind of sheet music. And so if you're familiar with a lot of my materials, I have the group identity cards as well as a list of how to use them. I have a list of questions to use anytime you want to analyze a policy or practice with inclusion lens. I have a lot of handouts on tools to respond in the moment, including pairs and engaging skills. And so these are cheat sheets. You can call them music sheets, sheets of music. The panning tools you use in a moment as you're scanning the group dynamics, deciding how you want to intervene. So in the box of engagement, you need those reminder tools, and then lots of practice and lots of peer feedback and feedback from people a little farther ahead. And we're really trying to increase people's capacity to share what they know, to meet people where they are, and learn how to facilitate, learn how to train, coach, mentor, lead meetings, help others on the path. So that's the intent as you're working with folks, if you're lucky enough to have a bunch of engagement. So here are some things you could do. Teach them path to competence, and not quickly. With the in-depth work that I'm doing with you, teach them not only the model, help them identify and talk about when they were in denial, fear, judgment, and what helped them move. That's a lot of conversation. What helped them grow specifically, and then how can they do that, share it, facilitate that with others. As I mentioned, all the toolkits and checklists they can review right before meetings, in meetings, have in front of them, to have in trainings. And then lots of depth work on privilege. So privilege affinity spaces where they're really looking at the common behaviors, the systems, practices, and policies where white culture is embedded, where male culture, hypermasculinity is embedded, middle class, upper middle class culture, kind of Christian beliefs are just get embedded into how we do things. Now a resource, there are many of them. My book, But I'm Not Racist, Tools for Well-Meaning Whites. While I focus on race, I do believe one could read that book from any other privileged identity and then just translate into heterosexual, cisgender, not having any disabilities, being 40s and 50s by age, senior level in the organization. So looking at the common oppressive attitudes and behaviors, the internalized dominance, examples of privilege, the costs and benefits, as I've said, of colluding, of speaking up, the cost benefits of leading change agents, change efforts. Because while you're training and they're pretty good interpersonally, they may not be very far along. They could be in fear around systemic change. So part of when you have folks in the box of engagement is to strengthen their skills interpersonally while you're building their skills systemically. And so having the same question and the prompt, it will just be much deeper and much more nuanced and complex. Box of engagement, people are increasingly able to claim privileged and marginalized identities, intersections, and the nuances and complexities much more. And so if you're thinking they already did that activity, doing the playing card activity with 20 people in the box of engagement as they're developing their capacity as inclusion practitioners, inclusion partners, be a very different conversation than even the box of fear or denial. So I want to encourage you, you don't have to find a brand new activity, because these folks, in my opinion, could and should be learning to lead that activity. So if they literally do it as a participant 5, 10 times, each time they're learning something different about how to facilitate it, much less in the real-time moment. They're learning so much as they're having authentic engagement. So it's incredibly important that in these peer learning groups, affinity spaces, they're practicing how to recognize and interrupt privilege, these privilege dynamics. So it's not only what is white privilege, what is class privilege, but how do those dynamics show up in the interpersonal and the systems dynamics? in us and other people. And practicing using case studies first, maybe, so it's a conceptual practice, then demonstrations, you as a facilitator and get some people involved, then maybe fishbowl where they, as participants, are doing it, maybe with your support, and then finally in role plays, where they're self-regulated role plays. You have a small group facilitator. Scaffold the practice of recognizing and interrupting, and then getting peer feedback, and then more and more practice. You want to have lots of videos of effective engagement that you show them, but also they make. And so the designing of these videos in itself is a great learning experience because you have to figure out what is more effective, who's going to play what role, and then they develop it for the organization. So they're creating it for others, but they're really learning about effective engagement on themselves. But you can use videos that are made, video clips to show more advanced techniques, have them then practice it, and have a few folks that are closer to competence work with you to create a few that are pretty complex. And so have them watch it, analyze it by group membership, what's the impact, and practicing to scan the dynamic of all the people in that video. Now, again, you can do it as a fishbowl, but you can always go back and replay a video. Who has the most discretionary power, i.e. who will be heard, listened to, whose ideas might be considered faster than somebody else. And of course, it'll most likely be people with increasing privilege identities or relationship to the senior leader, even if they have marginalized identities. And folks with one or more marginal identities have decreasing discretionary power. Now, they can speak up, but it doesn't mean they'll be heard or listened to. And as you're watching these videos, add the concept of discretionary risk. Now, these are concepts I learned from LCY Cross Associates when I was working with them. So who has less risk? So personally, me with all my privileged identities, I can speak up and say things, and I'm not getting thrown out of the organization, thrown out of the club. People might be irritated I did it, but I have very little discretionary risk because I have multiple privileged identities. Folks with one or more marginal identities, especially folks of color, are not given much room to speak up. And so there's far more risk for people by group membership. And so to have your folks in engagement analyze case studies, fishbowls, demonstrations, what's the power, who will be heard, who's got the risk, and then practice what they might do given their real memberships. And maybe they need to first talk about their personal fears and anxieties, nervousness, given how much power they would be given by that situation and how much risk they would be taking in those kind of situations. Have them talk about it, then have them practice. You could tell practice is the key word here in engagement, practice and feedback. So analyzing policies and practices, services. Now you introduced it, maybe box of fear. Here, with the group identity cards, they are doing lots of it, but they're doing real ones. In fear, I would do ones that are not related to the organization. I might do some of the ones I teach about so that they're generic enough that people can get the skill and see what's possible. Here, I would take real live situations, have them bring ones that you think are pretty effective, they already maybe shifted them in their team, and then bring some that they think could be improved with an inclusion lens, and have them real work groups, analyze them and make recommendations, chart them, and then take that information, share it with leaders. I think it'd be great if you had some senior leaders meet with folks who are doing this work to share, here's some policies we looked at and here's some recommendations so that they get to use what they're learning to really help change the organization. You also want to be training them how to do that back in their unit. And so understanding discretionary points, how to analyze a policy or practice for those moments where someone with their inattention or intentional bias could create a practice that benefits, privileges folks, and disadvantages, marginalizes, and create barriers for others. So have them learn it and do it, and then say either who wants to learn how to do this, and that could be a whole nother workshop, or do it with all of them. Because these folks are in development, if not already, serving as informal or formal inclusion partners, practitioners, They might be facilitators, and so you're deepening their capacity to train, facilitate, to lead meetings. And so they might be co-leading search committees, but if not, you're developing to do that. And so all of these skills, you're helping them get to be change agents in your organization. And so anytime you can get them creating real things that can be used in the organization is wonderful. Now, a way to support folks, because this is a lot of work. It's time that if it's not recognized in their job description as 25% of their job or 15% of their job, then they are doing this on top of their job. Now, they know that this is helping them be career ready for the next career move, or to be really able to do some of this training on the side if they want. And I think reverse mentoring is a great way to provide support while they're also investing a lot in themselves in developing the skills that is helping the organization move faster. So a way to give back. I first heard this concept. I was working with an employee resource group of LGB, I don't think they were T yet, in a financial institution. And they came up with this idea. So what they did was they identified key senior leaders that were far enough on the path to competence, they'd be open to this, and really needed more work. Now, they didn't say that, of course, but they floated the idea, and they said, we'd like to invite you to be a reverse mentor. And what that means is we will match you up with someone from this employee resource group, and they will support you deepen your capacity to learn about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, because by that time, the organization was just beginning to address a deep struggle around gender identity. And so we can personally help you deepen your capacity here. And in return, because we want it to be a mutually beneficial, in return, in our time together, you coach me around my career goals, maybe some skill gaps around navigating politics, change management, or you just tell me how you do your work, and I learn through osmosis, so it's a mutual beneficial. You could expand that concept to be across any category of privileged, marginalized, or even multiple privileged, marginalized dynamics. But again, you're going to want leaders that are late fear and know what they don't know, are ready to learn. You don't want, back then folks were in denial, and so they did it as develop a personal relationship, learn to care about each other, and that helped the leader want to move in to learn more. But today, I would strategically do it with people who are somewhere in the box of fear, hopefully further along. And then key skills training for box of engagement, supervising across difference, leading diverse teams, creating inclusive organizations. Any and all of that could be great deepening for people in engagement because they're getting more, how do I use these skills day to day in everything I do? And so a few more. You might have people who are ready to be trained as inclusion facilitators. Now, they're probably doing training already, and that's different from being trained as really competent inclusion practitioners, inclusion facilitators. So, because people already serving on search committees, maybe they're co-chairs of inclusion change teams, unit change teams. So, deepen their capacity. So, a train the trainer. You can teach folks around meeting management, inclusive conversations, engaging difficult dialogues, and then give them some practice serving as small group facilitators in trainings, organizational forums, any and all of that. So it can be officially they want to train trainers, or some of the more facilitation skills, people need to use those in everything they do. And so you can create workshops where it's, you want to be a supervisor, you are a supervisor, you are leading a task force, come learn the kind of skills to be more effective. And all that I just named could be great for people engagement. You could scale that back in fear. People in box of fear, they would just not get as in depth, and they'd have to realizing, oh, what I don't know about meeting management and uninclusive conversations, and how do I mess up difficult conversations. So you just kind of back a bit more, but you'd still do skill building. At this level, people could be practicing navigating difficult situations, real ones. Now, I'm not saying real time in the moment, though. In workshops, if something real happens and I've got engagement people, we'll go into it deeper than I will if they're in fear or denial. But have people bring real situations, confidentiality, cone, of course. But then practice, what would you do if? They can send them to you ahead of time so you generic them up, but people in the room know that these are situations their colleagues are dealing with, and so they're practicing. And have them do it as a participant in a group, as well as, so a role play of someone's a leader, but difficult situation happens. How to do participants when you don't have the discretionary power, and how do you do it when you have discretionary power because you are the leader of that search committee. Now, search committees historically today have so many horrific microaggressions, so I would actually use search committees as you're trying to teach this. Have them come up with the kind of dynamics they've seen and heard, and then real-time practice what they would do, and then collect that information and use it in training search committees. Turn it into checklists and case studies so that you're using folks in engagement to develop more resources for the organization. As you're navigating difficult situations, all that I write about in Turn the Tide, what are your common triggers, intrapersonal roots, a lot more work here. How to shift your triggered thoughts at steps 3 and 5, your intentions, all of that is critical. And you may want to start training them, so how can you share these as a coach, as a mentor? So how can you start sharing what you know around triggering events with other people? And really the work for them is, because just because your engagement does not mean you don't trigger yourself. So lots of deep work on how do you de-escalate your triggered emotions, thoughtfully respond, and not react on an automatic triggered reaction. And then how do you share these? All of these can be things you do with folks in engagement. Something else, engagement. Teach them and train them how to lead discussions to get teams, task forces, search committees to navigate, negotiate inclusive engagement norms. And my webinar, How to Create Inclusive Classrooms and Teams, might be a place where I teach that, as well as some of my other webinars. So how do you do it when you're only a member of the group and you don't have the positional power? When you do it, how do you do it when you're a leader? And you might also do, what do you do when you're a member of the group and the leader's not really leading it to create these guidelines? How can you influence the leader to do it? In fact, how do you manage up would be a great thing to do with folks in engagement. How do you manage up when the leader is not interrupting microaggressions, and there are many? How do you manage up when they're not willing to, or they're not leading the analyzing policies and practices? So how do you do it from your position, given the discretionary risk and your discretionary power? These next ideas I thought were fun. I could see a study group where folks are reading about change agents history from multiple contexts, different group identities, whether it's a book club, a study group. And it doesn't have to be history. It could be leaders in your field that are currently change agents, or from historical. And then I'd look outside your field and also historical figures. Folks in engagement, I know as a white person, when I read, name's not coming to me, but I read a book of a white woman back, I think in the early 1900s, who was actively partnering with folks of color and actively working to dismantle racism at a time when she could have been disappeared. And it gave me such motivation and hope to realize, a century before, folks who looked like me were just putting themselves on the line in ways that I was not yet doing and not yet ready to. So it's a thought. Empowerment work. Can folks in engagement be organizing action, taking collective action in the community, region, legislature, maybe in the organization? But some type of, some people call it community service work, but not that patronizing, we're here to help you, but really working with people in the community. So some type of empowerment work. The reason I say this is sometimes organizations are not ready for people who are in engagement. And so helping them learn how to create change in a lot of different ways as you're getting the organization ready for the folks that are ready to partner and work with them. Peer coaching groups can be doing any and all that we've been talking about. But as a structure, I think it's critical that they have people, they're learning from each other, each one teach one, and it's just more practice, more development, and intimacy, so that people will give feedback. Feedback is such a gift, and folks in engagement to learn the skills of how to give feedback effectively across differences, how to receive feedback across differences, privileged, marginalized. Practicing that, teaching others that is a critical skill set. And how to sidestep fragility so that you don't jump back in the box of judgment, how to sidestep defensiveness, do the inner thought work as well as the staying with your body, and then have them give real-time feedback to each other. What I appreciate about you, the skills I see you developing, what I'm learning from you, and here are 2 things that I would love you to focus on learning more about, being able to do differently, more effectively. So feedback can be given in a way that's still future-focused and not out of the box of judgment. People in engagement, if they aren't already, need to be assigned as co-chairs or chairs, equity, diversity, inclusion advocates that serve on change teams, search committees, helping to run task forces, the diversity advocate that is on a new project. And then we have to give them ongoing support training, many of the skills we've been doing, but pulling them together, a space to debrief, strategize, practice interrupting. Like, this is what, again, it has to be high confidentiality, but this is what just happened. But I went into freeze. I didn't know what to do. So they practice it in these ongoing development situations, and then they can go back and do them. So again, fishbowl plays, demonstrations, but real practice where they're doing it and getting feedback. And then I would, again, set up a structure so you have inclusion practitioners that are working with their unit or their divisions, working with their senior leaders. You have inclusion facilitators that are working in their units or maybe other units. Maybe they're used whole organization-wide. And then you have EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion advocates that might be used on search committees or task forces. So bring all these folks together for maybe quarterly development, because then they're doing some all cross-sharing of what progress they're seeing, what gaps they're seeing. And this group, again, you can teach this anytime, but this group would be a great group to teach discretionary points mapping. Now, this is similar to the analyzing a policy or practice, but it can be even bigger. So you could take the entire recruiting practice, A to Z, and teach folks how to first map the current state, formally what's written, and then all the informal moments. Then identify every moment where someone with bias or inattention could make a decision. That's what discretionary points are. That could either increase our chances of recruiting and retaining and hiring racially diverse, culturally competent leaders and staff, or a decision at that moment could keep the status quo or actually create more oppression. So it's huge. So they got the concept already where they're thinking about a form they use when employees apply. You're looking at the form. They may have already done something like that, but this could be the entire onboarding process, from what's on our website to what gets said as we offer them the job, because that's when the onboarding is happening, all the way through, I think, 18 months easily of intentional onboarding. So that's what could be happening. You can use folks that have all the competencies. They still have to think about it, but use them to shift and recreate and give recommendations for major systems in the organization. All the HR practices need to be analyzed with a discretionary points mapping. And this is another major skill set from Cross Associates that I learned there and that I teach. And always recommending changes. And then how can you take these skills back to your sphere of influence to get your team discretionary points mapping, something that your team is doing. Take a deep breath. If folks stay in it and keep going, then they may have moments or longer time that they're in competence. They are in the flow, unconsciously effective. They're responding without having to plan much, or think at all. Habitual automatic responses, and they are committed to staying on the path. They are unaware how effective they're being. It's just how they show up. And so the intent, if you're lucky enough to have people in competence, that sound incompetent, that's what I said, in the box of competence. A lot of remember when, because these are the folks that could and should, if not already are, leaders, facilitators, change makers. And so supporting them to keep deepening their competence, staying on the path is ongoing development. So what else you could be doing? What helped you learn and grow? How can you do this for others? How are you doing it for others? So facilitators coming together, sharing a lot, leaders coming together. How are you creating change, systemic work? How are you facilitating caucuses if that's what they're doing in their competence work? And then how are you weaving all of this into everything? Every coaching, mentoring, training, leading, meeting, how are you bringing it? Because these are the folks that are the new culture that you want to create everywhere. So getting them sharing what they're doing, and then they would be the small group facilitators for the folks that you bring it together who are in engagement. So there's cross-fertilization there. The people engagement see, oh, I can do that, but they didn't have to think about it. And so keep getting people to see what the next level looks like. Here you really want folks learning change management strategies. Now you might do it with the folks that are in engagement, but studying in your field, in other fields, what's working in your organization, not so much recommendation, but studying the concepts and theories of how do you create systemic culture, meaningful change. Learning about that. I love the multicultural organizational model, MCOD. Doctors Bailey Jackson, Rita Hardiman, Evangelina Holvino are the folks whose writings that I've studied over the years, and I got to study with both Bailey Jackson and Rita Hardiman. I love this model. There are many variations of it that you can find in different books, and there are other ways to do this work. But this is a model that is so easily understandable by people, and they can quickly identify where they think places are, where they think their organization is, unit, their division, and then some of the work that's been developed by the authors as well as what I've built on top of it is therefore where are you and how do you move forward? Getting that model or something like that in them, and then what are the strategic actions to help move, and then thinking about how can we implement these? How do you lead this? So they're moving in and deepening their development as inclusion change leaders in the change teams, search committees, practitioners, maybe they're training search committee chairs. They're facilitating all sorts of things. These are the folks you want deepening their capacity to influence the organization by sharing what they know with others. But they still might need training of trainers, facilitators, part 2, part 3, part 4. And how do you implement these programs? So yes, you're an inclusion practitioner, but how do you develop this in your division? How do you develop a mentoring program in your division? So they're developing, leading, maybe they're still doing, but they're going to that next level. I think these folks are ready to be trained how to lead affinity spaces. Now, you might have employee resource groups that are being led by people in judgment, in the box of fear. They still may be useful, engagement even. But folks in competence, in the box of competence, would lead it very differently. Again, my book that you can get access to, but I'm not racist. Actually, the reason I wrote it is I wanted to share with anybody who would read it how I lead white caucuses. And I believe I do it out of the box of competence, maybe a little engagement. And so I wanted people to see different ways they could do it. So getting more and more people trained, how do you facilitate affinity spaces where they can easily, just without thinking, own and claim their own internalized dominance, the racist or sexist thing they just did, and support people in recognizing that, recognizing oppressive behaviors, skills to interrupt, all that can be affinity spaces, but you need people to lead them. And then to be having healing spaces, all the internalized dominance, and particularly leading healing spaces for internalized depression, the imposter syndrome. Folks in the box of competence, this could be one of their interests, and they can deepen their capacity to do it. As you can tell, it's just continuous professional development, self, and then leading others, teach them, keep learning, teaching. Always coming together to share what we're learning with each other, support each other, because this work is long and hard. It takes years to do culture change. But the folks in engagement and the folks in the box of competence are your folks out in the field who can be mobilized, rewarded, supported, developed to be hundreds of people doing this work to really get your culture moving much more quickly to be inclusive, engaging culture that it needs to be. So I hope you found this helpful, that you're seeing more and more ways that you can use the path to competence, Jack Gant, Delight Frost's work, to intentionally plan, develop, design professional development opportunities, workshops in your organization and for yourself. So I just have a few final thoughts. I hope you share Path to Competence with everybody you know, and I hope you share how I've taken it and suggested you use it as a diagnostic tool, because you can get people together to analyze your current designs using the lens of each of the Path to Competence, those 5 elements. Who have we designed for kind of unconsciously? Then think, who are our people? Therefore, what learning activities might facilitate movement, deeper growth, what is needed, and maybe even faster along all 5 elements. And then for us personally as facilitators, designers, to be prepared to adjust in the moment as the people in the room on virtual training show us who they are, and then we need to adjust. I believe intentionally using the competence as a diagnostic tool, a planning guide, definitely increases the impact of our workshops. We facilitate more deeply, we have more meaningful dialogue, and we accelerate development, increasing capacity of folks, of all people across all identities, to create more meaningful, sustainable change, to work collaboratively as they build more equitable, inclusive environments that truly accelerate success of everyone across all identities. Hope to see you in the next video.